Edward Isaac Dovere is Politico's chief Washington correspondent. He joins me now from Arlington, Virginia. Hi. Thanks for joining us. So what an interesting guest list there. You've got senators from Democratic senators, Manchin, Donnelly, Heitkamp, all of which come from states that the president handily won. What do you make of this guest list?
Well, this is an invitation from the president rarely isn't without a political aspect, no matter who the president is. These are 3 senators who are up for re-election next year, 3 senators who, for various reasons, have been open to conversations with the president. In fact, Joe Manchin and Heidi Heitkamp both met with the president during the transition. From early out, they were eager to meet with him. And Heitkamp was there in North Dakota last week, flying on Air Force One with President Trump to talk about tax reform. So there is an openness to talking about tax reform from these 3. Of course, in a Senate where there are 48 Democrats and 52 Republicans, if you have 3 Democrats who are going to join the Republicans, that gives them the insulation they need, essentially, to be thinking about a vote that can clear the Senate, which is not something they could do on health care.
Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin is saying that the White House will get tax reform done by the end of the year. President Trump, we know, wants an overhaul of the American tax code, but is there a sense that Republicans are on the same page? And is that really feasible when you don't have a budget?
There is a sense the Republicans are not on the same page on this. Tax reform is complicated, and we also don't know whether this will actually be just a tax cut instead of a real tax reform, of which there hasn't been a bill since 1986. That's because tax reform is complicated. The tax code is complicated. Deciding which changes you're going to make, which loopholes you're going to close, that's all tricky business, and people have different constituencies that they're going to be trying to cater to and serve as they're thinking about it. So for Republicans, they will have to be getting through their own divisions, which are obviously pretty intense. We saw that over the Obamacare repeal effort. We saw that even with the Hurricane Harvey funding and debt ceiling raise that happened last week. And whether they can pull that off at all, let alone in the next couple months, is a really big question.
Are you surprised we haven't heard much of the details? And we've heard senators like Ron Johnson come forward saying he's on the House Budget Committee, saying that we don't have an outline of what this tax plan looks like. So if you're hearing from people on the House Budget Committee who don't know what's going on, I mean, how feasible is it in just a few months to push that forward?
Well, look, if they want to start moving on it, they can. And there has been work that's been going on these issues for a long time. There are ideas out there. There is the beginnings of legislation out there. It's a question of whether there is the motivation politically, legislatively to do it, whether the Republican conference can come together and figure out a way to get something that's palatable to at least most of their members, and whether there will be enough Democrats to come along and support it too, both in the House and the Senate. You saw last week the deal that was struck passed with some Republican support, but if not for the Democrats who voted for it, it would not have passed. There would not have been a Hurricane Harvey relief funding that passed. There would not have been a deal to keep the government open that passed. So that's all happening now in between now and December. There is this essentially deadline because the deal that was voted on last week comes up at the beginning of December. Whether that will put the fire to Congress to actually move on getting something to the president's desk, we don't know.
And we know earlier today the president met with the Malaysian prime minister. We have a bit of sound from that. I want to play that for you.
Okay.
Does not do business with North Korea any longer. And we find that to be very important. We had a vote yesterday on sanctions. We think it's just another very small step. Not a big deal. Rex and I were just discussing. Not big. I don't know if it has any impact, but certainly it was nice to get a 15-0 vote. But those sanctions are nothing compared to what ultimately will have to happen.
So the Malaysians likely cutting off trade with the North Koreans as the U.S. tries to curb the nuclear ambitions. How significant do you think that is?
The only real question about the economic impact on North Korea comes down to China. China is the biggest trading partner, economic supporter, essentially, of North Korea. And if China stays in contact with North Korea, then it's not going to make a huge difference probably with what the rest of the region does, even if all the other countries in the region cut off all economic relations. We don't see that happening quite yet, though, even on that front. But China is the question here, and whether President Trump will find some way to make headway with the leaders of China to change what's going on in North Korea is not clear. What we do see already is that the president has struggled to get on the same page as China on a number of other things, and has said that he thinks that it should be easier than it is, but so far he hasn't gotten to where he says he would be able to get to.
And potentially he might be traveling to China as well later this year, so it'll be interesting to see what his comments are in the coming months. I want to switch gears for a moment and talk about Steve Bannon, who suggested that moderate Republican candidates up next year should actually go forward and face primary candidates. How are Republicans on Capitol Hill responding to that?
Well, they don't like it. One of the things that we know about Republicans or Democrats is that they don't like the prospect of having to face challengers in primaries, and would rather not have to face them in general elections either. But when you go into next year, the sense is that the political environment is going to be tough for Republicans anyway. It always is for the party that's in control of the White House. There are always headwinds that any party goes into, no matter what the historical moment is. And given how much energy there is among the Democratic base right now, it would seem like Republicans will have tough fights. If there are primary challengers who are drawing incumbent senators or incumbent members of Congress toward more the base, toward more the closeness with President Trump, that could prove a problem for them, especially if they have to spend a lot of money defending themselves that they won't have then to spend in general elections.
Got a little palace intrigue question for you. We learned that Hope Hicks has been named the permanent White House communications director. We've seen the rise and fall of Anthony Scaramucci. What was behind the president's pick here?
Well, there are very few people in the Trump orbit who have the kind of relationship with the president that Hope Hicks does. She is not an experienced political operative. She'd not worked for a campaign before. She was signed on to the Trump presidential campaign. She was doing publicity and PR for some of the Trump brands and for Ivanka Trump's brands. She has developed such a close relationship with President Trump over the last few years, and that has played out day by day in the White House. She is the one who really knows what's going on and who can really have a conversation with the president. She's not known necessarily as a great political strategist or communications strategist, but she is a person who knows how to think about what the president likes in terms of his engagement with the media and how to manage that well. She's been quite successful at it. It's notable that for all of the stories that have been out there, backbiting and backstabbing and not always backstabbing in this West Wing, sometimes to use Anthony Scaramucci's term, front stabbing, you haven't seen those knives come out for Hope Hicks in a very public way. You haven't seen her drawn in to a lot of the questions that are out there about the Russia scandal. So she is of a different type than many of the other people who are in the West Wing.
You make a very good point about that, and that sometimes trying to stay above the water and not get knifed is says something. I want to thank you, Edward Isaac Dovere, for joining us.
Thank you.